all within the span of about 3 years. No wonder that on many of the technical issues, such as the cartological requirements of surveys, the concept of free and prior informed consent, and even the process of appointing personnel to lead the various offices of the NCIP, this agency has been in constant retreat. Laws by their nature essentialize, reduce, or simplify identities. Laws need to freeze a snapshot of reality in order to achieve predictability. They have to be simple enough to be administrable. They have to be clear enough to encourage acceptance by those who operate within our legal forums, chambers of legislation, as well as our administrative offices and courtrooms. Even the most progressive human rights advocate on the side of indigenous people's rights who do legal advocacy must contend with these realities. Those that provided the language in the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act, and we were one of them, were informed by this dilemma. On the one hand, providing texts that would encompass more possibilities for what will constitute ancestral domains or territories would have been too threatening for legislators and their propertied constituents. It would have also been threatening for settled beliefs of some human rights advocates. At the time of its formulation, information and understanding might not have been sophisticated enough to provide perfect guidance to the formulation of the provision. On the other hand, a law such as this needed to be passed in 1997. The political climate was ripe for its authorization. Today, the labels indigenous peoples, ancestral domains, informed consent, customary law are familiar terms introduced by the 1987 Constitution as well as the IPRA. Yet the balance of concepts, the ideas of the institutions it would require, and the procedures that were delegated have not met up to present expectations. Legal definition should not trump further political discourse. The failure of the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act, the unintended consequences that it generated, should not detract from the agenda to correct a historical injustice done to many of those who still consider themselves as these types of Filipinos. After all, laws that pretend to be universal and therefore untouchable are easily unmasked by the unforgiving requirements of the multidimensional, multicultural, multi-genre, polyvocal present. The categories and standards of behavior in rules and law embed a representation of reality. This representation, on the other hand, is informed by a standpoint, a view of a solution to a present problem. How it can ever represent the variabilities of who we are in the context of our politics and cultures in an era of cosmopolitarianism and globalization is the enigma of legal representation. With this, we learn that lawyers are not simply implementors of what the law is, nor are they simply oracles of what it should say based on the evolution of justices and judicial doctrines. Effective legal advocates know the basic principles suggested by ordinary legal texts. They know the variations of legal interpretation suggested by jurisprudence, but they should transcend them so that idle legal discussions take their place within the context of genuine political discourse. Law is really a transient definition of society's interest articulated through imperfect and dominated human structures. There is nothing sacred in its form, nor in its contents. The challenge to the lawyer is to know when to use it, not so much to maintain an unjust status quo, but to gain leverage for more just and fundamental changes. Maraming salamat.
One decade after the implementation of the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act, there are difficult questions that continue to trigger much discussion and debate among academics, advocates, and activists on the indigenous people's question. The more provocative questions revolve around the relationship between identity and rights-based politics and the new neoliberal agenda, particularly in the context of extractive industry. These questions include, are the two goals of upholding the rights of indigenous peoples and creating conditions for favorable conditions for foreign investment compatible? How is the state able to respond to the needs and aspirations of its indigenous peoples in an era of neoliberalism? How does Philippine state assert its autonomy when working with multinational corporations and international financial institutions to develop infrastructure, resource extraction, and other projects? My take on these questions are based on a decade of engaged research and advocacy on indigenous peoples' issues in cooperation with indigenous peoples' organizations, federations, and communities, and I draw my conclusions specifically on case studies and comparative studies in Luzon and Mindanao. I forward the following three key arguments. First, IPRA has essentialized the notion of indigenous identity, resulting in conflicts in indigenous communities. The law assumes that IPs are a homogeneous category by defining them thus, and I quote, a group of people or homogeneous societies identified by self-ascription and ascription by others who have continuously lived as organized community on communally bounded and defined territory, occupied, possessed, and utilized such territories, sharing common bonds of language, customs, and traditions, and other distinctive cultural traits, or who have, through resistance to political, social, and cultural inroads of colonization, become historically differentiated from the majority of the Filipinos, unquote. Empirical evidence reveals that, contrary to the standardized and romanticized notions of IPs, indigenous communities are now differentiated on the basis of socioeconomic status. Hence, it is quite possible to see the more advantaged indigenous peoples marginalizing other indigenous groups, including members of their own clan. Indigenous communities are also in a state of flux. They are not frozen in time and space. They have been accommodating and at the same time resisting influences from outside. Indigenous socio-political institutions have also undergone revisions in response to changes, such as transitions from subsistence to cash economies. It is possible, therefore, that authority has shifted away from elders to the younger, educated, and moneyed members of the community. By essentializing indigenous peoples, IPRA has engendered cleavages amongst the indigenous communities, further entrenched the status of the elite IPs at the detriment of the poor IPs, and consolidated the power of the state and neoliberal institutions. The state is a key player in the conflicts in indigenous communities. To begin with, it is the one that defines the authentic IP by virtue of IPRA. The burden of proof of authenticity rests on those who claim an indigenous identity in order to gain recognition of rights to land. It also requires institutional codification of history, traditions, and customs. To prove time immemorial connections to a primordial identity and to land and territory, indigenous communities are tempted to resurrect indigenous or traditional cultural beliefs, practices, and institutions, even if these no longer exist in the ethnographic present. New pasts, histories, and new identities are created or imagined, to borrow a term by Benedict Anderson, in order to claim the present. However, representations of history and culture are at once subjected to contestation by indigenous peoples themselves, who now have different and conflicting positions over claims to land and resources. They turn to the state, who serves as the supposed neutral judge of authenticity. The indigenous organizations or communities then become mired in a painstaking, technical, administrative, and highly bureaucratic process of identity recognition and land delineation. The IPs also become trapped in what is known as repressive authenticity that ignores colonial history and creates a false binary opposition between tradition and modernity. This artificial dichotomy denies the possibility of hybridity in all aspects of IP life: economic, social, political, and cultural. In fact, IPs today live interculturally in a space that is neither essentialized traditionality nor essentialized modernity. The lack of institutional recognition of this interculturality is at the heart of the highly problematic triangulated relationship between the state, multinational corporations, and indigenous communities. Second, the struggle for and the recognition of indigenous rights have the potential of being just as debilitating, incarcerating, and divisive for indigenous communities on the ground as they are empowering. Besides giving the state the role of arbiter and ultimate judge of authentic identities, IPRA has also given the state the prerogative in deciding who has the right over disputed land and resources. This has resulted in even greater involvement of the state and of neoliberal institutions in the community's internal affairs, regulating the details of the claim, shaping political subjectivities, and reconfiguring internal relations. In our case studies of conflicts over land and mineral resources, the state usually colludes with multinational mining corporations in ignoring existing indigenous socio-political institutions, especially when the latter hinder the entry of capital. Instead of using indigenous institutions as the channel of free and prior informed consent, the state imposes notions of parliamentary procedures and processes that are alien to many indigenous peoples. In some cases, both state and corporations take advantage of existing cleavages within IP communities, isolate the oppositionists, and appoint as official IP representatives those who would give their consent to multinational corporations' operations in the community. These machinations of state and big business results in further domesticating and disenfranchising the indigenous peoples and in reinforcing what James Scott calls the state's greed of intelligibility or simplicity. This is not to say that indigenous communities have not gained any substantial achievements from the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act. Certainly in many other communities, the IPs have used this law as an instrument for their empowerment, especially in communities where they are strong, united, and are able to shift the balance